guys. This is Hunter, and I'm so grateful that you're joining me on today's episode of the Inspired Studies podcast, where my hope for listeners is that they not only gain new insight on Holy Spirit-inspired topics, but are also inspired to go and engage in their own personal study of these topics so that they may learn more about God in a personal and intimate way. Today, we dive into segment 2, where I invite a guest speaker to join me as we discuss how the topic from last week's episode impacts our own Christian walk through personal testimony. Didn't hear last week's episode? Don't worry. You can check it out and the resources provided from last week's episode in the links below. In addition, be sure to check out the study questions that are attached to help you jumpstart your own study. With all that said, I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, let's begin on the second segment of today's topic. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Inspired Studies podcast. I'm your host, Hunter Land, and today I'm accompanied by my awesome friend, Makayla Damato.
What's up, everybody?
Howdy, howdy. And we're going to be talking on the topic today of anxiety. And so our own personal experiences with anxiety, how we've worked to manage as well as work to overcome the anxiety that's within our lives by surrendering to God. Now, a little bit about why I chose Miss Makayla. I actually had the awesome experience of getting to do a mission trip with Makayla when we went with our young adults group and we went to the Dominican Republic. And seeing the growth of Makayla from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip, to me was just like, wow. There were so many things that I had seen that she had anxiety about before the trip, and then seeing how she overcame that by the end of the trip, I was like, oh, I know I've got to have her here to talk about this. So yeah, as I say, do you want to tell us a little bit about that in regards to the mission trip?
Yeah, sure. I think two really big examples was, so my entire life, I have been super anxious and never felt comfortable or liked praying out loud. I know a lot of people share that with me, but I can honestly say that after the mission trip, God has completely healed me of that. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's been, other than a little bit of back of the mind, a little bit of anxiety kind of stuff, there's hasn't been a time since the mission trip where I have not wanted to pray out loud or felt so anxious that I just couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And that really, I think, came from, we actually had, at one of the churches we went to, mm-hmm. we had a time where we did a salvation call, and we had a lot of mothers and children come up and receive Jesus. And it was so amazing to see. It's kind of hard to explain it other than being there.
Yeah.
But we were about to go sit them back down, and God just kind of said to me, no, you need to pray over them before you just send them out as new Christians. You need to actually pray for them and encourage them to know that they have a church family now. So I was like, all right, God, I guess this is the time I'm overcoming this anxiety of this. And I kind of tapped the translator on the shoulder and was like, hey, can we pray for them real quick? And he was like, absolutely, and called them back up, and we prayed over them. And that was kind of a big turning point. I think the other really good example of that was they were asking one of the nights who would like to share their testimony the next day. Mm-hmm. I have never shared my testimony before. I've honestly really felt like I didn't really have a testimony, to be honest, because I've always been a Christian, kind of just grown up in the church and everything. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until then that I was actually sitting down and writing it in the hotel room. I was like, okay, I can see how this might help somebody. We'll see. Let's just go for it, see what happens. And I had one of the mission trip members, Addie. Shout out to Addie.
Addie.
She listens to this. But she probably prayed for me 5 or 6 times throughout the day before I actually went up on the stage and shared my testimony, and because my heart was pounding probably the entire day and during. But it was just, I don't even know how to describe the peace I felt about it, but I actually did that, and mm-hmm. God does have a story from me, and I didn't really think I did before that, so.
And may I say, from personally actually getting to hear it, it was an amazing job. She did great. I know we were all like, whoa, yeah! After she was done. It was great. And I mean, so in part of that, you kind of talked a little bit about some things that kind of gave you anxiety, like you said, praying out loud, as well as sharing your testimony. If I may ask, I mean, even for like just regular life, and like, what are some things that maybe give you anxiety just within, maybe for example, for those that aren't on the mission field and things like that, what are some things that maybe give you anxiety in your day-to-day life?
Yeah. I feel like it can be really different for everybody. But for me personally, I think a lot of my anxiety and my experience with it has become from a past history of depression as well. And I think that depression came from a low self-esteem and a bad self-image I had of myself, and just not really knowing how God really saw me as a child of God, and what he actually says I am in the Bible. So that kind of led to a lot of perfectionism, like wanting to do everything right and make sure I was doing everything to the best of my ability and putting in the best effort and those kinds of things. But it also led to, in relationships, like not just like romantic relationships, but relationships with my family, with friends, like leaders, bosses, everybody, just a anxiety about how I'm seen and how I come across to people, and like how they see me, and that I'm coming across the right way to them, and what I'm saying, what I'm doing, those kinds of things. And it leads to a lot of guessing myself and second guessing what I'm saying and doing. Like, I've literally had my husband read text messages that I'm sending to people because I'm like, am I saying this right? Does this sound okay? And I know that might sound really silly, but especially over technology and everything, everybody knows things can come across differently than you're meaning it to. But those are the kinds of things of really just like how people view me and see me, I think.
Yeah, and I think I can relate to that especially. I know I share a lot of that with you as well, in the sense of like being a perfectionist, making sure everything looks right. But like also for me, a big thing was self-image, especially with like my arm disability. I was very self-conscious about it, especially because like I had told people before, like whenever I would first meet somebody, the first question they would ask when I was younger is, well, what's wrong with your shoulders and what's wrong with your arms? And so I became very self-conscious about that. And I hated the way I looked in pictures, and I hated the way I looked in videos, because I was like, well, I don't like the way I look. And so I became very anxious about that. And I know over time, like I desired for people to see me for who I am. And so I tried to put up a, like image of what I wanted people to see. And so with that was like something that for me was a struggle within that of, well, if they don't see me this way, I've got to find a way for them to see me this way. Kind of like you said, like, oh, I need to change this, or I need to go back over this, or I need to fix this of what I said so that they, like me in this way. And so I know that was like my own personal struggle. And I know for myself, that didn't change until I finally started to kind of learn how to accept myself for who I am and how I'm made in God's image, and how he has created me to be unique. But that definitely took a while. That didn't just happen right overnight. That took years for me to get there.
Yeah.
So if I may ask, I know you had talked about that it kind of impacted your relationships, but how has these different anxieties that you've had, how have they impacted your Christian walk?
Well, I don't think I really realized how much it was impacting my walk with Christ until a couple years ago. And it just really goes back to that idea that for me, the anxiety came from a low self-esteem and low self-image, and I didn't see myself the way that God sees me. So if I'm not even seeing myself the way God sees me, then how am I supposed to have a relationship with him? Because it's really hard to like walk and talk and act the way that God wants you to act and talk and speak and everything and live your life if you don't even feel like you're good enough or able to be that way. So it leads to a lot of like well, I'm not good enough to be doing that. So, and I don't want to come across the wrong way. If I try it and it's not good enough, then I'm just not going to do it. And so I think that's a big part of it. And it really wasn't until I started dealing with the self-esteem and the low self-image that it led to a lessening of that anxiety. And my relationship with God started to actually thrive and grow. So
Yeah, I know that God's definitely pointed this out in me, and it's still something even to this day that I'm working on. But like I realized that insecurity that I had led me to idolize the approval of others and seeking their approval of, okay, I need to do the right thing in order for them to like me, and I need to do this thing in order for people to approve of me. And I started to live for that. And God revealed to me that you're living for people's approval when you should be living from my approval.
yes, absolutely.
And again, that's still something that I'm working on even to this day. I mean, it's not like I've got it fully down 100%, as we had talked about earlier. God's still working on me.
Sanctification is a lifelong process.
Amen. I love. I want to get one of those shirts that they have where it looks like a construction sign and it says "Christian under construction."
Yes.
Because it's like we are continuously under construction, still being worked on every day.
Absolutely.
So, what are some ways that you have worked to manage your anxiety, both practically and physically and spiritually?
So I think those are all different things. So you do those very different ways. For me, I don't think I really realized I dealt with anxiety until I started going to counseling for my depression. And then I was like, oh, wow, I'm also have this going on too. But I went to see a secular counselor because I was able to get free counseling with my EAP program through work. So praise God for that. And she was wonderful. She had some great advice, gave me let me talk out a lot of things and helped me kind of dig to the root of a lot of stuff because there was a lot of, I think it's called behavioral modification therapy or something like that was what she mostly specialized in. So it wasn't like I was being prescribed medication or anything like that. It was just like trying to help me figure out the roots of where these things are coming from. And that came at a lot of like time and chiseling down and getting me to the point where I was like, okay, I guess I need to go. Honestly, I had a lot of encouragement over the years with my husband. He was like, you need to go. It'll help. It'll help. But I don't think it was really until this past year and I started working with a mentor after having to go through some marriage counseling that I saw the difference of like having a secular counselor versus having a Christian counselor or Christian counseling and like to see like where those things are coming from or where the advice is coming from or where the
where the wisdom originates from, like where are they getting that from? Where's their source?
Yes, exactly. And like those practical steps, if they're not based in the Bible, then for us as Christians, it's not helpful because it's not going to lead to growth, because at the end of the day, we want to be improving with God and not through our own means. So if we're trying to deal with mental health things on our own, it's just not going to work. But if we do it with Christ, then we're going to see that growth. And I think it was only when I started doing that and actually leaning into God and surrendering to God was like when things started to really shift for me.
Yeah. And I know for me, I kind of came from the opposite side of it, where for me, starting out when I was younger, I had more of a negative stigma towards counseling. I was like, counseling isn't, it's for the weak. It's not that.
There's something wrong with you if you need counseling. That's
like literally,
honestly.
that's what I thought. Like, man, it's only for those extreme cases, and that's what I had originally thought. And it wasn't until for me, I was actually at a Christian retreat. And God was putting something heavy on my chest, and I was like, okay. And I wanted to go talk with one of the guys that I was on the retreat with. And as I went and spoke with him about it, he's like, well, hey, you should come and talk with me more about this. I am a counselor. I'm a Christian counselor. Let's go and talk about it. And I was like, counseling? Like, I don't think I really need counseling.
Yep.
And he's like, just try it out and let's see. And I was like, okay. And so I started to go, and it didn't, like you said before, like it doesn't just happen right away. Like, oh my gosh, we're done. Like it was definitely, I think I was with him for counseling for over 6 months. And then we stopped for a little while and then came back actually for a little bit to work on some more things. But for, like you kind of said, like within our sessions of our counseling, we looked specifically at, getting to the root issue, because like you said, there is that behavior modification, but behavior modification is only the surface level. And as he brought back to it, like oftentimes, if not all the time, it usually stems from something else that's the root that's inside. And so for me, I actually had a lot to work on that I didn't know. I had a lot of things that I had to figure out, as well as things that I had to work through that I hadn't originally thought I had a problem with. And the great thing about it was that he was able to give me some different terms to, like, the things that I was going through that I had never been able to conceptualize or be able to speak on, like codependency, where I was dependent upon certain people in my life to bring me that approval that I was so desperately looking for. Because I knew, if I can't get it out of out of other people, at least I can go to these specific people and I can get that approval that I need.
Yeah.
And so that was something that we worked through within my sessions of counseling that I never would have thought that I even had an issue with. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've been through situations where I've had friends just stop talking to me and not want to be friends anymore. And like, I thought that they were really good friends to me. And I honestly thought they were good, godly Christian friendships that I had. And then it wasn't until, honestly, like, shout out to Exchange, that like I actually met people like Hunter and like some of my other friends, like if anyone's listening, Michelle and Brittany and Amanda and Thais and all those girls, like I have never had such good, like, iron sharpens iron, good Christian friends that are just willing to be there at a moment's notice and call you out in like a loving way and actually be those good Christian friends that I needed. And like those are a lot of other anxiety situations where it's like when you don't know, when people are like, when people just reject you or leave, like those are like, I understand where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, and it's like, especially when you've had that past with people of rejecting you, and then it's hard to become vulnerable after that.
Yes.
Where it's like, well, I don't want to get hurt, or I don't want to reveal my heart and lay everything out on the table, and that person actually does walk away.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the great things personally about bringing it to God, is that no matter how big the mess is, God doesn't walk away. Like God's like, hey, keep piling it. Like, I'm here. Like, I got you.
I agree. Yeah, I love that.
But yeah, and so what are some different examples that you may have in which you've overcome some of those anxious situations or experiences?
Oh, so many. so many. Where do I begin? I mean, I think something that definitely it comes to mind first is this past year, honestly, and Hunter knows a lot of this story. But in April of last year, I found out that my husband was struggling with pornography. And that led to some marriage counseling and individual work. And of course, that leads to a lot of anxiety, a lot of self-doubt, and a lot of self-image questioning and those kinds of things. So it's hard to explain if you haven't been in that situation. But that I feel like it was God's timing and when that came out, because I was able to handle it. Like I was able to take a step back. I mean, I didn't handle it well all the time, so please don't take that way.
Right.
But I think God knew that at that point I was able to have the strength to take the next step and start working through it. And that was when I was able to start working through my own individual things. And like through the recovery work that I needed to do to heal from that trauma, I was able to work through a lot of my individual anxieties, depression, self-image, all those deep root issues that I never really dealt with. And it was through that not only I able to improve myself, but we have a better marriage now than I've ever had. So that's definitely one for sure. Another one I think is my husband and I also in this past year just bought our first house. So exciting. But if you've never bought a house before, definitely talk to somebody that has been through it, because it is anxiety inducing. Between the shopping around and all the work that goes into it and fixing things up, and it's kind of like you're learning things 24/7 and trying to keep up with all the learning, because you don't know any of this stuff until you start it. But that was definitely one for sure. But
I was to say, and how would you say your reliance and dependence upon God in those situations? How did that help you to get through it?
how do I put this? So when I was doing my counseling mentor work with my mentor Ro, it was during that situation with my husband, I had to choose between relying on myself or relying on God. And there was no other option, because in the very beginning of the work, I didn't trust my husband. I didn't trust him to rely on him like I had before. So all I had, my two options were myself or God. And it was only when I started actually leaning on and surrendering everything to God, of like including the stuff we were going through just between us, the arguments, the work, just our marriage itself, and just saying like, we're giving it to you, and we're going to trust that you're going to lead us through this, was when that growth started coming. And when you actually give it to God, he will show growth.
Yes.
And he will bring you so much growth that you didn't even know was possible. And it was only then when I was like, okay, even last month, I don't even recognize myself. I don't recognize my marriage. I don't recognize my husband anymore, because it's just so much at one time. And it's like, now even looking back a year from now, I'm just like, if I hadn't relied on God and depended on him and trusted him with everything, then we wouldn't be where we are now.
Right. And I think you brought up such a key term in the sense of surrender. I know for myself, it's always been a huge struggle of, okay, God, what does surrender look like? Because I'm like, dear gosh, I feel like I bring stuff to you and then I pick it right back up. And I don't know if you've ever had experience with like doing that, where you're like, God, I'm going to give this to you, but I'm going to come and pick this back up a little bit later when it doesn't seem to get solved when I think it should be solved. And that's kind of where it comes back to that. One of the statements that really resting upon is that just that God has control over everything. Like, the fact that God is sovereign and that nothing that happens slips through his fingers by mistake. Like, God knows everything that's happening. And so, I believe that there are certain things, like you said, where we go through different instances and scenarios that God uses to build us and to make us stronger later on in life, where it's like, I couldn't have handled that years ago, but where I'm at now and who God has created me to be, I am able to now. So, like, the example that I'm thinking of right now is actually, for me, something that kind of would give me, I would think, especially if I was asked to do this years ago and where I'm at now, of going on an 11-month missions trip. And leaving
Whoop, whoop.
and leaving everything behind. Again, I'm leaving my family, I'm leaving my job, I'm leaving all of my personal belongings, like everything. Like, again, I'm going to shout out to Addie real quick. When she told me that you are literally living out of a backpack for an entire year, like, I stopped for a second. I was like, you're joking, right? She's like, no, I'm serious. You're literally living out of a backpack. And I was like, whoa. And I've gotten, as I've been telling people about my trip, like, yeah, I'm going to these different countries. And they're like, aren't you scared of what's going to happen to you? And I'm like, no. Like, honestly, no. Like, I know from the different experiences that I've walked through in my life that God has brought me through, that God is trustworthy. You know, that if I'm to go over there and I'm to die, then that's what, God is going to have in that.
Mm-hmm.
Or if God wants me to live and to come back, like, that's what it is. Like, kind of coming to that point of, God, I trust you in whatever season and wherever you take me. Like, and kind of like you talked about this earlier, like, whatever God has for us is the best.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is what's to happen, then so be it. But I trust in God that wherever I go and whatever I do, that God is going to take care of me through it. And if that does happen, then so be it. But to live for Christ is gain.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to, like, recognizing the control that, like, we don't have control over our life. Yes. God does. God is, and I don't know if that sounds right or not, but
no, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that's honestly a lot of the times where our anxiety comes from is like you want to control every little thing and you realize you can't, so you try to control something. But it's like you try to control something because you can't control everything. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, well, I'll control this little thing right here because I can't control this that's going on.
Yeah, for sure. And, like, recognizing that at the end of the day, God is in control of your life. So when we're talking about control and that God is in control of our life, something that just came to mind as an example is, because definitely having control over my life is something that gives me anxiety. And I know I mentioned earlier about my husband and I's testimony from this past year, and something that during one of our sessions with them, I was talking about my, like, severe anxiety of my husband having a relapse and not knowing if I could handle that again. And Larry, my mentor, and her husband, who's Ben's mentor, was talking about how anxiety is a spirit of anxiety. And we were kind of talking about how there's different ways you can react to that spirit of anxiety. Mm-hmm. We're all going to be tempted, and we're all going to go through anxious situations, whether it's severe or just minor. Mm-hmm. But we can either spiral and try to hold on to it and try to control all the little parts of it, or we can give it to God. Mm-hmm. And we can surrender it to God and recognize that He is ultimately in control of what happens. Mm-hmm. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I know in the study I'd kind of talked a little bit about it. But for example, prayer. I had talked about this even within my first episode of just prayers, that communication with God and laying everything down at His feet. I mean, it's including our anxieties and the things that make us anxious and going, God, I don't want to hold on to this anymore. I got to give this to you. And honestly, for me, that has been one of the most freeing things to do, is to go, God, I can't handle this. I can't hold this. Mm-hmm. I need you to take it, because on my own, I'm going to crumble. And so, God, I need you to intervene. I need you to step in. Another way that you can do it, kind of going back again to the first episode of how we build a relationship, but is also reading the Word and reading the Scripture and reminding ourselves of the promises of God. I know there's a specific verse that you have in mind.
Yeah. This past year, like this physical year in January, I started the Bible in a Year plan, and I am really happy to say this is the first year that I've actually kept up with this plan, and
more than I can say for myself.
But for me, that's such that alone, I feel like, is just glorifying God, and the fact that before this year, I struggled so much to create that discipline of actually being in His Word. And of course there's still ways I can improve in it, and those kinds of things, but the fact that I've gotten this far just shows how much God has started to grow me this past year. And one of the verses that's kind of my life verse that Hunter was mentioning. So one of the verses that I really love is Romans 12:21, and it says, "Do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good." And for me, and like the work I do and my job, and my marriage, and just all the things in life, it's like, at the end of the day, we can choose how we're going to react, like we talked about. And we can choose to either be evil back to whatever's going on or react wrong in a situation, or we can respond with love and grace and with worship and worshiping God regardless of the situation we're going through. So.
Yeah, actually, that goes right into the next one of praise and worship, and
Yeah.
praising God even in the midst of your anxiety, when you're going, God, the waves are crashing all around me. I don't know what is going on, but God, I'm going to praise you, and I'm going to continue to just state and remind myself as well of just how good you are, how sovereign you are, how just majestic you are, even in the midst. It's like where we're so caught up with the waves all around us. And I mean, if you look back even into the Bible, where, that was what happened with the apostle, where he got so caught up in looking around him that he took his eyes off of Jesus. And it's like, I think that tends to happen with us with our anxiety. That anxiety is that thing that we take our eyes off of Christ and we look at how big our problem is. And instead, and I love the quote where it's like, we should be telling our anxiety or our problems, like, look at how big my God is. Look at how sovereign he is, even in the midst of it. Now, and again, I'm not saying that you just say that to your anxiety and call it a day, because that's not always going to be the easiest thing. But like I said, that can be something where it's, again, and coming back to it, you're keeping your eyes on Jesus. Yeah. So even when things do get chaotic, even when things do get tough, and you're like, God, I don't know how you're going to get me out of this, but God, I'm going to trust in you.
Yeah. And more practically, too, I know it's easy to say these things, but then when it actually happens and a situation actually comes up, and of course I still struggle with this, I'm sure Hunter does too. Yes. Like, we're never going to get this perfectly, I don't think. But to have a plan of how you're going to respond.
Yes.
And thinking about, like, when I arise in an anxious situation, this is what I'm going to do in response. And knowing that ahead of time, so you're not frantically trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do right now to handle this
you're not
properly?
trying to shovel out the water while it's pouring in.
Exactly. And something that I know has helped for me through my counseling and my mentoring sessions with Ro is, one, journaling.
Yes.
I'm still not great at it. I try to remember to do it a lot, and if Ro listens to this, I'm sorry. I'm trying.
See, that one's mine, where I'm like, I love to journal, but yes. But like I said, then getting into the Word, literally doing the devotionals, gosh, I cannot do that like you can.
But something else that I felt like was really practical for me was from my secular counselor. She talked to me about the 5 senses. And I know Hunter and I talked a little bit about this, like planning for this podcast. But if you've never heard of that, I encourage you to look it up. But it helps just in general to calm all your senses down and it brings you more to the present, so you're able to handle it better.
Exactly.
And then something as like another plan of action. I was telling Hunter a little bit about my personal promises list that I have. Again, something I learned from Ro. But
shout out to Ro.
For real. But if you've never heard of it, again, I would encourage you to look it up or reach out to us and I can explain it a little bit. But basically what it is sitting down during a moment of peace and when you're in a good place and really thinking back to what are all the things God has done in my life so far, and supporting that with what like a situation and supporting that with why that's important, if that makes sense. So, for example, like one of mine is reminding myself that I am loved. And then giving as my example is that remember that God brought your community of women to you. So remembering that I'm loved because I have that community and because God gave those women to me and that those people in my life. Another one being you're worthy of doing miracles for. And I know that's something that's really hard for me at least to believe, is that like I'm worthy of that kind of miraculous gifts from God. And my example for that is that, remember, on your wedding you prayed in faith and even the wind and the rain ceased. And that's a story for another day.
Yeah.
But just examples like that, and it's something that you can always look back on during a time of anxious or scary situation, and remember that God's done this before and he'll do it again.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a great point of surrounding yourself with community as well. I know for myself, while I may not have like the personal promises, for me, one of my big ways is definitely journaling, where I get to put everything out onto paper and go, God, this is what I'm feeling. This is where I'm at. But I also, for myself, have a group of men that I surround myself with, where if I'm having, anxious thoughts or whatever it may be that I'm going through in life, that we can be iron sharpening iron with each other. And so it's not just one-sided where it's like, hey guys, I need you, I need you, I need you, I need you. It's we're there walking with each other through life, because again, as we know, life is messy for all of us. It's not just a one-sided thing where only I'm going through something. And if you're thinking that, oh my gosh, I'm the only one that's going through something like this, I'm gonna just say right up front, that is a lie straight from the enemy.
You are never alone in that anything.
No. And I will say, like, for me, and kind of actually going back a little bit into my own story of like, whenever I was struggling with my struggles with pornography, and I was really like, God, I don't know what to do. And when I had people open up, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm not the only one struggling with this. And so for me, knowing that I have people in my circle that I can turn to whenever I am going through anxiety, that has been something that's helped me. And again, what I would suggest is find people that can point you back to Christ. Don't just get a hype man. Like, yeah, man, it's whatever, just shake it off. Like Taylor Swift, shake it off. But rather find people that are going to point you back to Christ, that are going to point you back to God's promises. So, for example, sometimes there are times where I'm like, man, I'm really struggling with this. Or my friend texts me and, hey, I'm really anxious about this. And I'll send them a Bible verse. And I'll be like, hey, this is what God put on my heart when you sent me that. Here you go. And just, again, pointing them back to God's got you. God's going to take care of you. There is no need to worry in this situation. God's got this.
Yeah. And it can be really scary to open up to a group of people and like try to find those people to begin with, especially if you're like me and you've had friends that just didn't react the best, or just left because of no reason, or kind of stopped talking to you. It can be really scary to try again and try to find that community. But it's so worth it in the end to find those people. And it just makes such a difference in your life.
Yes. Well, we are going to be getting ready to run out of time. So I do want to ask Miss Makayla, do you have any final words or any thoughts that you would like to share with our listening audience?
I'd just like to remind everyone, especially if you are dealing with anxiety and how to manage it, you're never alone in whatever you're going through. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to need counseling. It's okay to need counseling plus God, plus community, plus all of the above. It's okay. And just remember that God has you and God's in control of whatever situation you're going through. And you'll get through it. It may take a while, and the valley may seem it's so long. The fact that I'm sitting here today is just a testament that he will get you through it. Because even just a few months ago, I straight up told Ben, I told Ro, I told like anybody that was in my circle, I don't want to share this testimony. I don't want to be labeled that like that's what we had to go through. But now, because of the growth and the honestly miraculous change that I've seen in our marriage, I want to share it because it is a testament to God's glory and what He can do in someone's life. So just remember, He's got a plan for you, whatever that is. No one knows it except God, of course, but there is a plan and there is a future for you.
Yes, and I want to say to those who are, know that stuff isn't for me and I got this on my own, know that you don't have to walk through it alone either. I would suggest to you not to walk it alone. Number one, that's a lot more lonely doing that, but also, again, we're meant to live in community, to bear one another's burdens, to strengthen each other, and to iron sharpen iron. And so I encourage you, if you're like, no, that's not for me, like, take some time and spend some time first getting to know God, but also getting to surround yourself in community that can encourage you, that can uplift you, and that, again, can remind you and point you back to Christ. So thank you so much, guys, for joining us on today's episode of the Inspired Studies podcast. A huge thank you to Miss Makayla.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and so I hope you guys have a awesome day. Love y'all, and peace out. Thank you so much for joining us today on today's episode of the Inspired Studies podcast. Again, I hope that you not only gained new insight, but also became inspired to study this topic further for yourself and how it affects your own Christian walk. Not sure where to begin? Don't worry. With this podcast, I've attached the link to my study notes, as well as the sources and a download link where you can download the study questions that pair with the study notes. That way, you have a resource to jumpstart your own study, whether you decide to do so individually or in a small group. As always, I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, and share with others. And while this is a non-profit podcast, if you'd like to give, I'm currently raising funds for a missions trip that'll be going on for 11 months called the World Race. If you feel led to give, I'll have a link attached below. Any support is greatly appreciated. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you all have a great day. Stay blessed and stay inspired. Bye-bye.